Hey there, everyone. This is Craig from Acid Horizon, and today on the show we have Gabe Gottlieb to introduce to us the work of Johann Gottlieb Fichte and the foundation of political right. This may be our last official interview for 2024, but we have a few other goodies coming out in the subsequent weeks, and also this month, at the end of the month, just before the new year, we are going to have our first official meeting of the Anti-Oedipus Files. This is a reading group that we conduct at the $5 level on our Patreon account. And the easy way to join is just to go to our Patreon account, subscribe at the $5 level, and you are in. You are going to get a year's worth of intensive study of Anti-Oedipus and the texts that inform the work of Deleuze and Guattari. And if you haven't already joined the free Discord server for the Schizoanalysis Project, go ahead and do that. That's on the pinned link at the top of our page on Patreon. We want you to be part of these projects, so please join. Okay, let's get to speaking with Gabe Gottlieb and interrogating the foundation of political right.
Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory podcast. And today we're going to be taking a trip back to the land of German idealism, looking at the work of Johann Gottlieb Fichte and his foundations of natural right. Karl Marx once said in the first thesis on Feuerbach that idealism was the only real philosophy to develop things on the side of the subject, in terms of practical sense-making activity. And I can't think of anyone who exemplifies this more, really, than the work of Fichte. And to talk about Fichte today, a kind of a holiday Fichteanism, a Fictimus, if you will, is Professor Gabriel Gottlieb. Gabriel, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. I mean, can we just start off with talking about sort of who was Johann Gottlieb Fichte? How did he kind of fit in with the history of philosophy? And indeed, how did you come to take such an interest in his work?
Yeah, sure. Well, Fichte is a German idealist, typically classified within that group of philosophers. Those philosophers, as I'm sure folks know, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, they're kind of the big four German idealists. Born in 1762, dies in 1814. And so he's a philosopher living in a tumultuous time. He's someone who I think really took a shining, if you will, to Kant's philosophy and the critical philosophy. Early in his career, he was a tutor and was tutoring Kant for one of his students, and essentially had to read Kant and as quickly as possible, and read through the three critiques, and particularly was moved by the second critique. And he famously says there's a kind of shift that it brings about, a kind of transformation from a dogmatic philosophy, a kind of Spinozistic philosophy, to the philosophy of freedom one finds in Kant. And almost immediately he dedicates his life to developing, teaching, and working through the Kantian system. But at the time, there was this real sort of concern about the foundations of Kant's critical project. A lot of people, Fichte, Reinhold, Schelling, saw that Kant had the right conclusions, but did not have or did not put into place the premises from which these conclusions followed. That's how Schelling puts it in a letter to Hegel. And so many of them were obsessed with providing a foundation for Kant's philosophy, and Fichte played a major role in that project. That's really in some ways the source of his philosophical project, what he calls the Wissenschaftslehre. The German word just means science, a doctrine of science, doctrine of knowledge. It's one of these German terms that's essentially untranslatable. So I always just call it the Wissenschaftslehre. And there he provides a first principle for what he takes to be the Kantian project, grounds a theory of knowledge and ethics, a practical philosophy. And from there, he builds a political philosophy and kind of runs with this project. It reminds, for folks who might be familiar with Husserl's philosophical work, Fichte does something kind of similar. He continually returns to this foundational project to try to get it right or revise it or make it clearer. So sometimes we speak of different versions of this foundational project, the Wissenschaftslehre. So he's essentially obsessed, trying to work this out from roughly the 1793 up until his death in 1814. A lot of people know Fichte perhaps best for some of his work that's tied to nationalism. He wrote a terribly influential, and I mean terribly in both senses, influential work called The Addresses to the German Nation, which is a kind of proto-nationalist text. That's often where people know him outside of philosophy. But his work was taken up by figures like Schelling, Hegel, who were both receptive but also critical. And he's continued to exert a kind of significant influence, particularly in continental philosophy. And I'd say in recent years, more so in Anglo-American philosophy. Maybe that's just a very brief kind of, or maybe I should say relatively brief introduction to him. I can say a lot more, of course. As for my interest in Fichte, it actually starts ultimately with Marx and trying to understand 20th century Marxism. I got caught up in thinking about figures in the Frankfurt School, but I was especially interested in Lukács. And then I got interested in a figure who's not widely sort of read these days, French Greek philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis. And I was working on Castoriadis, did an undergraduate thesis on Castoriadis, which is a totally bizarre thing to have done since literally no one knew anything about him who I was working with. But he's really focused on the imagination and thinking about the imagination within a political context. And that led me to the German Romantics and Fichte, because in some of the literature, they're identified as figures who sort of work through a conception of the creative imagination. Ultimately, I kind of moved away from that interest, but that was sort of the first context in which Fichte appeared for me. So I started working on the German Romantics, Novalis' Fichte studieren, and then dissertation time, you got to figure out what you're going to write on. And Fichte just seemed like someone who was understudied. And it's that kind of thing where you can write another dissertation on Kant or another dissertation on Hegel. And I was just really excited about doing something that was understudied and I could develop in some interesting ways. So that's kind of the story as to how I got into it. But for me, it was really, I think like a lot of people drawn to Fichte, it was the politics of recognition and seeing that his conception of recognition really shaped and influenced Hegel. And so that was sort of what hooked me, I guess.
No, I think fantastic. But it's in a way, a teacher of Kant that he's so influential, as you say, on the German Romantics, some people like the Wallis and the Schlegel brothers, even on the teachers that as you said, would teach the young Marx. And even for sort of our more French theory heads, not only Castoriadis, but there is a under-examined relationship really between Fichte and Fichte Deleuze. The last essay that Deleuze writes has a very strong Fichtean citation in it. Self-positing is kind of one of the shadow, I think, of a lot of what Deleuze ends up doing. But when it comes to the text we read today, The Foundation of Natural Rights, I know that Fichte was also quite a controversial sort of writer in his own time. I think he was even barred from teaching during, I think it might have been accusations of pantheism, I think. So what's sort of the context of this book? What stage in Fichte's attempt to elaborate the system, at what point does this book come about? And at what point in his career is this coming about?
Yeah, sure. So his career is broken typically into two periods. There's the Jena period and the Berlin period. The Jena period stretches roughly from 1793 up until 1800. And then the Berlin period picks up there more or less to his death. The Jena period is the period most people who know Fichte or have read Fichte are probably familiar with. And there he's very much trying to develop this Wissenschaftslehre project, which is an attempt to provide, as I said, a foundation to the Kantian project, but through the concept of the I as a pure self-reflexive activity, an activity that reverts into itself. And in virtue of that activity, posits itself as an I. It's a kind of self-constitutive or self-constituting activity. And so Fichte's thought is like, what what can we do a priori from an analysis of this conception of the I? How can we ground, or to what extent can we ground a philosophical system, theory, practice, and so on? And so this book, The Foundations of Natural Right, is published in 1796 and 1797 in two parts. And it comes at this period where he's in Jena, teaching at the university, giving lectures on right and other topics. And he's trying to take the system that he's developed, which is developed along certain principles of the I positing itself, in opposition to a not I, which places a check on the I. And then Fichte is concerned with how do we reconcile these opposing activities. And from there, he begins to derive or deduce various categories of the Kantian system. So he's got this foundational project he's laid out. Now he's invested in how do we apply this to practical domains like political philosophy, natural right, and to the domain of ethics. And so the subtitle of the book, Foundation of Natural Right, the subtitle is According to the Principles of the Wissenschaftslehre. And so there he's trying to figure out how to apply those principles to this more practical domain and derive the concept of right and a theory of property in the state. You know, the thing I think about when I think about this work, I think of it I'm very kind of contextualist in some way, or somewhat contextualist is probably more fair in how I think about this work. It's part of a debate that was developing at the time in response to the French Revolution. And so Fichte actually had written a book prior to this about the French Revolution. But this book is an attempt to intervene in a debate that's happening amongst Kantian jurists. So when the French Revolution occurs, all these Germans are thinking about Kant's moral philosophy. Kant had yet not developed in 1789 a robust or theory of politics. And so there's this question, how do we apply Kant's moral philosophy to the political domain? Can we provide a Kantian deduction of right? And there's an explosion, much of it Kantian, of work on deducing, deriving, or applying Kantian principles to the domain of right. And so there's a debate that occurs, and many of them think that you can just derive a principle of right from Kant's moral philosophy, and the normative force of Kant's moral philosophy will transfer to the domain of politics. And Fichte initially tries to do this in his book on the French Revolution, but is criticized quite a bit. I could say maybe a little bit about that at one point, but in this book, he intervenes in this debate that's taking place, and he moves away from trying to derive a principle of right from Kant's moral philosophy and gives a deduction of right or derivation of right that's independent of moral considerations. And so that's kind of its novelty within the context. But out of doing that, he develops a theory of recognition or mutual recognition that plays a role in developing a kind of political philosophy of property, contract, and more traditional things you see in political works of the time.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's just one something I wanted to pick up in terms of somewhere where Anglophone readers and listeners might not pick up is two of the distinctions that cut across Kantian philosophy and indeed, as you say, are picked up in Fichte. One is between the concepts of morality, in German, Moralität, or right as a Recht. Because in a way, from an Anglophone perspective, it seems like, well, why can't we deduce right from morality? If Kant has a philosophy of morality, why doesn't he have a philosophy of right? And Fichte is very strong in saying that he is not doing a deduction based on the internal moral law in terms of the conditions of the will and how we can have a moral effect upon the world. Rather, it's about right. And I think there's also the additional split that does come from Kant, which is the split between the I as we experience it in experience, the I that feels hungry, hot and cold, and the foundational principle that every subject, every experience has a corresponding sort of quality of being the experience of mind, of an I that can say, I think this, even if it doesn't, but it still has to be able to. And could we sort of just lay out sort of the terms of these splits? So say, starting with the distinction between morality and recht, and the distinction between, say, the I and the ego. Because I think that's one of the hard things with Fichte is when we talk about the activity of the I, it's hard for people sometimes confuse that with a conscious, deliberative constructivism, rather than by the time we get to consciousness, it's because the thing that's been, the thing that we are is building it up to that so that we can now say, I have this kind of experience. It's making it possible.
Yeah, let me start with the stuff about the I. And so I'll use the term I, self. Das Ich, the term in German, often gets translated as ego in some older translations, which I think is unfortunate for a number of reasons. But also it occludes the connection between Das Ich in Fichte and Das Ich in Freud. So we always translate Das Ich in Freud as ego, but that's a mistranslation. Like it should just be the I. And so I think we've kind of done a disservice both to the German idealists and to Freud and how we deal with that I, concept of I. So Das Ich and Das Selbst would be the terms that Fichte would use between the I and the self. So when he's talking about Das Ich, the I, he's talking about the I from a transcendental standpoint, not the I from a lived experience standpoint, or even from a deliberative or empirical standpoint. That is, he'll make a distinction between that conception and another conception like Das Selbst, which has to do more with like your identity, yourself, in a sense that we're more used to talking about. So we could speak about our German self, right? If we wanted to talk about that, or the empirical self. And so in discussing Das Ich, when I characterize that, so what Fichte wants to say about the I is that minimally, it's a activity. So he pushes against a kind of Cartesian conception of the I that thinks of the I as a kind of substance. His conception is that the I is an activity. And connecting up to this point that Kant makes in the transcendental and deduction, the B deduction, that the I think must be able to be attached to any representation for that representation to be one that is mine. Fichte wants to highlight this self-reflexive, self-reverting activity of the I to, in a sense, capture what Kant would think of as a kind of transcendental apperception. And the move there is, and this is, I think, the innovative move that Kant doesn't necessarily see, is that in order to give an account of that activity involved in transcendental apperception, we have to characterize the activity as one that posits itself. And that reverting back into itself is what makes it the very activity that it is. And so the way I like to put it is it constitutes itself as an I. And so that is a necessary condition in order to have a thought or to ascribe an action to oneself. He's just interested in the minimal activity that's involved there. So then, of course, once we start talking about the self, and I've got thoughts about, I'm a philosophy professor and I think about myself in that context, that activity of the I at a transcendental level is what he's articulating and giving an account of. So there's that. Now, there's this really big question about how that idea informs his philosophy of right and moral philosophy. And so this brings us to the distinction between Moralität or Sittlichkeit, actually. So he's using that term, which we know from Hegelian philosophy is often translated as ethical life. Literal translation would be ethicality. But so how do we connect this conception of I to our moral lives? And how do we connect it to our political lives? And that's like a really tricky question. And I think one of the key moves we need to make here is to see that reason plays an essential role for him. One of them is, and you reminded me of this when you were just introducing this question of this mistake that's often made by not only scholars or philosophers, but his contemporaries who identify the I and say, oh, well, this is just the I of Fichte himself, where they sort of reify the conception of the I in some way and erase the transcendental dimensions that he's really invested in. So one of the things that he insists throughout his entire career, you can look at his earliest notes from 1793 all the way through, that he's essentially talking about reason in some way. That is this, and particularly this self-reflexive activity is the activity of reason. So reason itself has this structure. And so he has a tendency to identify the I with reason. The move he's making, so in the Foundations of Natural Right, he's less invested in this transcendental structure of the I. That's what he's taking for granted. And what he wants to show is that a necessary condition for the kind of self-consciousness we have when we are engaged in a particular kind of, let's call it I activity, if I can put it that way, and a particular kind of activity of the I is, so a necessary condition of this I activity is the concept of right. And the move there, though, and I think there's a real question here, the move there is, well, what is he talking about? He's talking about transcendental apperception as such, that is a necessary condition of transcendental apperception is the concept of right. Or is he talking about some higher, some not higher order, but something like reflective self-consciousness is a necessary condition of a particular type of I activity that is reflective self-consciousness? Is the concept of right a necessary condition for that kind of activity? And I take it that the most reasonable way of interpreting the text is to say it doesn't quite go all the way down to transcendental apperception, but a necessary condition of the I activity involved, or the activity involved in deliberation and reflection and that kind of mental activity is a particular kind of relationship to others. And so from there, he deduces the concept of right as a necessary condition of individual self-consciousness.
Yeah, thanks, Gabe. I want to ask a question that's basically going to have you go through everything you just said, but in a different way.
Okay.
This is actually my first serious engagement with Fichte. And one of the things that I recognized right off the bat is that the structure of the argument itself, it really resounds with Kant's moral arguments, the claim essentially that rational requirements entail some sort of moral requirement, which I always thought was one of the toughest pills to swallow in Kant's work. In some ways, I think Fichte is asking us to swallow an even tougher pill because he's moving it to the domain of rights, to the domain of the political. And I was hoping that you could just re-articulate where Fichte attempts to validate this jump from the ontological necessity that mushrooms out of the activity of self-reflection to the realm of ethical obligation. And maybe just to put that in simple terms, so given that there is, some sort of ontological structure to our understanding of who I am as an individual, and in virtue of that, being able to recognize that there are other individuals in the world, and seeing that at some level we are on the same plane in that activity of our self-recognition, that somewhere along the way, that process of recognition then mushrooms into a sense that we ought to have certain limits to our freedom, for example, or that there are certain ways that maybe it's within the ontological structure itself, which validate us having certain kinds of rights. And that seems to me always to be the big obstacle to get over, is how do we go from the sort of giant is of Fichte's ontology to the ought of his ethics or his politics?
Yeah. No, that's great. So there are a couple things to say. And one is there might not be an is of the ontology. It might be normative all the way down. But I'm going to put that to the side because that's like a huge kind of interpretive question. But let me try to resolve one issue that can come up here. And it really requires a clarification about what we mean by a right in the context of Fichte's Foundations of Natural Right. So I think there's what he's deducing is the concept of right. And the concept of right is going to be different from any particular right. So we might have a claim to property or a property right, let's say, as a kind of paradigmatic example of particular right we can have. We need to distinguish that kind of right from the very concept. And the concept he gives an account of is something like this. So this is the concept, right? I limit my freedom for the sake of your freedom, right? And there are different ways to kind of cash that out. One is like this, there's an internal act in which I limit through my own internal activity, my embodied freedom for the sake of you to act, to have the space to act, in which case you're also then limiting through your own internal activity, your embodied agency for the space of my freedom. And so that self-limitation, that concept of right as a form of self-limitation for the sake of the other's freedom, that is the concept of right that he wants to identify as a necessary condition for the kind of reflective, deliberative agency we exercise as rational beings. And so the idea there is there's a kind of social interaction that is conditional for self-consciousness. And that's a thesis I think is, when you put it in those terms, is not as hard to swallow, if you will, as saying, I have to have property rights in order to be deliberative, self-conscious agent. Now, his thought is once we recognize this reciprocal relationship between us, there are going to be other things that we're going to have to, that we can derive from that begin to set up what he would take to be a legitimate state. So let me just see if that helps in solving some of those worries.
I actually want to complicate my question a little bit further by looking at his claim that there is, in the activity of self-recognition, the coming to awareness of the free efficacy or agency of ourselves. And in that recognition, we then recognize that other individuals in the world may actually have the same capacities to be the kinds of rational beings that we're becoming too. But this at some fundamental level, you're saying it's normative all the way down, which actually in some sense I might agree with you, but isn't there an ontological claim here that there's a kind of univocity of the being at the level of rationality in its capacity to recognize itself? And how is that not an ontological claim?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the thought here is that the way in which, so first of all, it's an ontology of activity. So I think that's important. Insofar as it's an ontology of activity, it's got a normative element in it to the extent that there's a kind of end or orientation toward which one must achieve. There's a kind of achievement to it, if I can put it that way. So it's got a normative element in terms of it being a kind of activity toward which there's some achievement. And so in the sense that we can speak of ontology broadly as a kind of analysis or getting a grip on being in some way, this is a being of activity that has a normative element to it insofar as what is being is the achievement of something. What is the achievement of something. And so I think like from the very beginning, this sort of self-positing has some kind of minimal normative element to it that then that then carries itself through all aspects of the system to the sense in which what he thinks we ought to be doing is striving to achieve reason in the sensible world, to bring the sensible world in harmony with reason itself. And so maybe that's how I would start to try to answer that is ought question you're sort of getting at. I know there was another element to it, but it's totally escaped me.
You know what? Me too. But, we could really get into the weeds with just that, but I'll turn it back to Adam.
No, I think this is a very important question. I think in terms of the lineage coming out of Kant, I mean, I completely agree, Gabe, that he is trying to move right in here in a way which doesn't quite necessarily historicize apperception or the deductions in the first critique. We don't really get that until really Schelling and then later Hegel. But I mean, Kant's deduction of basically the rights that the self or the I has to apply the categories to the world is based in not the activity of the I itself, but in a certain style of argument that is derived, as scholars like Dieter Henrich point out, directly from the law of the Holy Roman Empire regarding property disputes. That is an externality. For Kant, the categories are facts. I mean, there are moral facts as well. For example, the fact of freedom for Kant, even though it's not a fact within the world, but neither are we entirely within the world. But in terms of, I mean, the ontological is-ought distinction, there's one of the things, the way that Fichte tries to bridge this is by thinking about the way in which, because it's trying to unite the first and second critiques. Now, what do I mean by that, listeners? I mean that in terms of the way in which our experience is possible comes with it a normative component, because insofar as partially as of all German philosophy, there's an element of the pun in this, which is, in German, positing is setzen. Setzen, literally setting in a way. Not quite Stellung, that's more like setting, but setzen, setting something up. What is law in German? It's Gesetz. It is having been posited, having been set up. And as I understand it, and of course, please correct me if I go wrong on this, it seems if the self's activity is one sort of setting itself up for experience of an external world. And then in a way, setting up an external world of objectivity and sensuousness and experience, which in turn limits that activity. It's setting up its own limits for an activity, but how does it return to itself? How does it set up a relationship to that world other than just being abstracted, if it is, by definition, a free and unbounded activity? In order for it to be free, it has to essentially call itself to go beyond the world of the senses. And what calls us to go beyond the senses is the same power and the same structure as rights. And I think he's taking it beyond morality here, because Kant's view of morality is not so much, it is a should, but it's not just a should, it's literally a causal power. It's the causal power that we have from the understanding, from the intellect, that allows us to add something more to the world than just being completely determined by our empirical inclinations, our desires, our pleasure. It's a higher kind of causality, which for Kant, and this is why Kant is so interesting, he doesn't have a lack-based theory of desire. No, desire is defined as when you have representation in your mind, and the presence of that representation leads you to attempt to bring it into being causally. Now, there's two ways you can do that: from within the world, through determination of your inclination, or from the part of you that's in yourself that's intelligible, but not quite knowable in the way that you can define it into existence, which is the causal power of the will slightly outside of the world, and that's what Kant is going to call freedom. And in terms of this Fichtean measure of going from the ought to the is, it really feels like what's leading that distinction, what's bridging it, is this concept of the summons. And I was wondering if we can get into the concept of the summons here, that we are called by ourselves to, in a way, even if there isn't someone else, posit another. Because Fichte says at one point in the introduction, the deduction of rights, that there's no singular human being, there is only ever two. If there was just one, then our free self-reflection would be completely bounded by the world and would never be able to reflect upon itself. Am I getting the Fichte relatively okay in that instance?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the summons is one of the really interesting moments in the text. I won't get into the derivation of it, which is highly complicated, but let me just sort of give an account of the idea and the role it plays in the system. This is a dialectical work in the sort of classic sense of thinking through tensions or contradictions within a train of thought and attempting to resolve them. And so there's some kind of synthetic move or dialectical move that occurs. He calls them syntheses. So the summons operates as one of these synthetic moves in his method of deduction. And that's the tricky part. And there's certainly, I think, going to be some fudging in how he's sort of thinking about these dialectical moves. But the thought is that he, in giving an account of how self-consciousness is possible, he argues that another rational being summons you to exercise your free efficacy. And the summons is an Aufforderung, is the German. So there's lots of questions about what's the best translation of this, but some options are obviously summons or demand or call or invitation. And basically the idea seems to be that the other is saying something to you like, hey, I'll use the example Stephen Darwall often uses, like, get off my foot, or a parent summons a child, put down the toy, come to dinner, right? And so these examples of summoning call the subject to exercise its agency in accordance with the concept of an end. So come to the dinner table. Rather than forcing the child and dragging them to the dinner table, you summon them and you give them this opportunity to exercise their own agency, to determine themselves to be self-determining, is how Fichte puts it. So it's in virtue of the summons that he thinks that the agent posits itself. In response to the summons, the agent takes up the concept of an end, makes that their own end, and then orients their agency toward the achievement of that end. Now, that's if someone accepts the summons. If someone rejects the summons, they're taking up an end. It just happens not to be the end that's built into the content of the summons. It's their own end. So the child maybe chooses and determines himself to act in such a way that they continue to play rather than come to the table. And so that kind of social interaction, that form of sociality, Fichte thinks is necessary in order for the kind of self-activity involved in deliberation, reflection, rational self-determination to be possible. And at the same time, he thinks that kind of social interaction is at the basis of a society that operates according to the concept of right and that builds itself, its institutional structures along the lines of the concept of right. So that's really the role of the summons there. It has there's two dimensions to it. There's a transcendental structure to it that plays a role in this sort of transcendental story. And I think one thing to say about the Foundations of Natural Right, which is really, it's a bizarre book because it's not just simply like, I'm doing transcendental philosophy a priori, independent of everything I could possibly know about the world in which I'm situated. And it's not a kind of empirically oriented political philosophy where we're kind of building in all of our assumptions about how the world is. It operates in this sort of middle place between drawing on transcendental reflections and also building in at times empirical considerations. Sometimes one scholar, Dan Brazil, calls his method here a kind of mixed method. And I think there's you could be really skeptical about that, but also maybe there's some virtue to that mixed method. So one place you see this here is in the account of the summons, where this call that you take something external and internalize it and make it your own end, orienting your agency, plays a transcendental role in the constitution or positing of ourselves as self-reflective agents. But it also plays a role in the empirical upbringing of children. And in a developmental story, he thinks that he can tell about how reason becomes actualized through degrees within a developing child. And so he was really invested in actual child psychology, I guess we would say today, but education and educational strategies. There's this pedagogue, Petzolazzi, who was super influential at the time, and he was reading his works and met him. And so he's really invested in how summoning plays a role in upbringing, and this gets worked out at the end of this text a little bit more and in other places in his work.
The next question I wanted to ask is actually going to take us out of the philosophy and maybe back into Fichte's history and historical context. One of the things I was struck by in the introduction was the fact that he was born in this interregnum between feudalism and capitalism, and in his lifetime saw, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, Adam Smith came out, and all of those ideas were circulating. And it goes on to say, without much detail, that his modest upbringing stayed with him through his work and his life. And I was curious what the political upshots and impact of this work were, given that he then became a proto-nationalist, especially looking at the philosophy of recognition. And I mean, I just simply don't know. You're going to have to fill in the gaps for us here, Gabe. But, does he emerge as a kind of Republican? Where does he stand on national sovereignty? How is it that he can affirm a highly nationalist stance in view of his politics of recognition? How does all of that come into play, especially given that perhaps one of the incipient motivators of him, both politically, ethically, and philosophically, is coming out of serfdom, his father being the first person in his family to not have been a serf, and he was a linen weaver, in fact.
I love that question because it really ties together so many elements of what his project is really trying to do. A lot of people say, oh, don't worry about the biography. He was born, he wrote, he died, whatever that Heidegger line is, something like that about Aristotle. But I actually think that Fichte's biography is important, partly because he's someone who kind of just thinks of, one, he's thinking about the self, right? But independent of that, he's just deeply takes things personally, really a personal sort of individual in the sense that like his stance, his background seems to continually come up and play a role in sort of his writings, and his thought and his writings are continuously tied to his personal biography. Like he says things that sound atheistic and he loses his job. So let me go back. So his family, his father worked with linens, a ribbon weaver, and he comes from very modest background. And he ends up, the standard story is he memorizes the sermon at the Sunday Mass, and a nobleman, Baron von Milk, comes and it misses the Sunday sermon, and Fichte's pastor says, oh, well, go check out Johann Gottlieb. He always can give an account of the sermon. And so this nobleman is impressed by Fichte and essentially takes him under his patronage. And Fichte is immediately thrown into this world of nobility and studies at the school Fichte, where Nietzsche, Ranke, and others studied. So he got a great education. And then he goes off to college. But eventually the Baron dies and his family no longer wants to support Fichte. So he's on his own and he has to tutor. So that's incredibly brief, like his upbringing. But he sees both sides of let's say the social economic world of his time. And I think that shapes, in some ways, a kind of egalitarianism that spreads throughout his political philosophy. So, for instance, in the Foundations of Natural Right, he argues that the state is obligated to provide basically property for us to labor on so that we can exercise our free efficacy. And so he ties labor to this conditions of what it is to be an I and to actualize ourselves as an I. And he develops a proto-socialist theory that comes directly out of this book in a text called The Closed Commercial State, where he argues that in order to get this theory of labor and property off the ground, we actually have to close the state off economically in the same way we close states juridically. And so he develops a monetary theory. And what's interesting about the monetary theory is it's a fiat currency where the currency is being used not simply for monetary purposes, but for political purposes. That is, to provide for the conditions for agents to actualize their freedom and exercise their labor and free self-determination. So you get this like quasi proto-socialist view. Now things start to look a little problematic because Fichte writes in his earliest book, one of his earliest books on the French Revolution, that there should not be states within states. And he argues that Jews should be denied civil rights. And so now things start to look really bad because you've got what I would call an anti-Judaism. I don't think it's a racism or an anti-Semitic model, but we don't have to get in debate that. But you certainly have an anti-Judaism. You've got this proto-socialism, and then you start to get in 1807 this proto-nationalism, which I can say a little bit about. So really bad picture, like seems like a proto-Nazi in a number of respects. He evolves on the Jewish question, and so that changes drastically later in life. His proto-nationalism is not an anti-Jewish or anti-Jewish nationalism. It's a French-German contrast or nationalism. So let me go back a little bit and pick up the thread of republicanism. I do think there's a strong Republican thread in his writings. I think really if you're looking at this moment and like post-French Revolution, American Revolution, it's hard not to be influenced by the emerging Republican traditions there. And so he definitely has a strong Republican dimension. Now, the worry he has is that leads to the nationalism or proto-nationalism is that Napoleon has abandoned the achievements or spirit of the French Revolution. And as Napoleon is moving into German lands in this attempt to spread the spirit of the revolution, Fichte thinks that's not actually what's going on. And so he writes this addresses to the German nation, which one way of reading it is as an anti-Napoleon, anti-French political track, in which he wants to bring the German people together as a force to hold back and push against the French intervention into Germany. And at the time, Germany is not a nation. It's the Holy Roman Empire collapses. You don't have a nation state. So the concept of nation is referring to the folk and the Herdeans and the herder sense of the folk, like the people who share language, history, but share social normative practices, share culture, myths, stories, fables, and so on. And so Fichte thinks that we need to unite in some way in order that certain achievements within our culture are not lost to this French intervention. And in particular, what he has in mind is philosophy. So the thing he's interested to some extent in preserving and promoting the flourishing of is the Wissenschaftslehre, which at one point in the text he says, I came up with this term for philosophy, but it never caught on. So I'll just speak about philosophy. And he's interested in the idea that this Kantian tradition, which has a sort of rational orientation, is not lost to the sentimentalism and in some ways irrationality, as he sees it, of this French intervention. And so he thinks what ought to be done is we ought to cultivate our Germanness and our heritage and through a kind of national education. So he's a proponent of sort of a national education that will retain and allow for us to flourish as a people so that reason can be manifested within us as a people. And it's nuts. I mean, it's absolutely nuts in so many ways. There's a language element to it. He thinks that German, sort of like Heidegger a bit, is the language of reason and philosophy and has a deeper connection to what he calls the Ursprache, the original language. And so doing philosophy in French doesn't get us as close to reason as doing philosophy in German perhaps does. And so there are all these like nutty elements to it. I actually, and this is a kind of radical kind of claim, I think, in some way, I actually think it's, in some sense, a kind of Enlightenment text. That is, he's really invested in retaining and preserving the achievements of reason. He just has a very parochial way about how that ought to be done. Now, the really interesting thing is he doesn't think German. There are all these tensions. It's one of my favorite texts because it's so crazy and so bizarre and puzzle. There's so many little puzzles you've got to deal with. One is this. He says he's critical of Hamann, who is this German counter-Enlightenment philosopher who is so caught up in sensibility and the language of poetry and the parables and so on. He's the anti-Kant. He was actually friends with Kant, lived in Königsberg, but he sees himself as like the anti-Kant. So Fichte, and Hamann is so German, there's this debate about the German language. Should we get rid of the H in certain words, certain instances in German where it's not necessary? It's like a silent letter. And Hamann, whose name begins with H, is like, no. So he writes a tract in defense of the letter H. And so he's like quintessentially like a German philosopher, right? And in a certain respect, a certain tradition in German philosophy, and has a huge influence on Jacobi and Herder. Fichte calls Hamann un-German, right? So like, how does that make sense? Well, he's un-German because he's identifying him with this French philosophy, right? Or this French sort of ethical life, if I could even put it in those terms. He says that it's not about what language you speak. It's not about, this is like one of the tensions, like being German is not essentially about the language that you speak. So what is being German about? It ultimately seems like it's something about Kantian, Fichte philosophy, endorsing this sort of project that's been laid out by Fichte and the post-Kantians. That's, in a sense, what he has in mind in terms of being German. And so, like, on the face of it, it's this really straight-up nationalistic text, it looks like. But once you try to unpack and sort of see what some of these, sort of deal with some of these puzzles in the text, it starts to look like its project has really clear connections to the Enlightenment. And so it's fascinating to me, at least.
No, absolutely. I think one, first of all, thank you for mentioning the Cloves commercial state. I think that's the most underrated, fantastically, beautifully weird text in the German idealist canon. I mean, I think you're right to say, put it in a historical context and look at the biography, because if you think about what Kant was trying to do, Kant was trying to end a whole series of philosophical questions, or at least give us some discipline to withstand them in the context, he does frame it in this way, of war. And if you think about the Holy Roman Empire, collections of must have been about 80 or so free cities and small states and big states constantly warring with each other between, of course, wars of religion, which leads to the Peace of Rhine-Westphalia, which is arguably one of like the events that defines modern nationhood. And Fichte, still writing at this point before the Holy Roman Empire collapses in 1806. Hegel, I guess, has the privilege of thinking through that. I think, this kind of turn towards the universal is exactly what he's trying to do here. The problem, as you said, the problem is the limitations are, one, if you're positing a summons into someone else, what if they refuse the summons on that basis? What if you're just positing your own desire in someone else and then sort of, trying to beat it back into them to try and maintain that? I mean, I think the example of Fichte's anti-Judaism is a great one for exploring that kinds of problems with those kinds of logics. I mean, you can definitely see a through line to, from Fichte all the way to Bruno Bauer a few decades later, who would make exactly the same argument regarding, and also this very very Kantian mode of looking at Judaism in the particular way it reads, and even the way it reads law, and we'll see this with Hegel as well. So I really appreciate you bringing up that particular context. I mean, I couldn't quite tell, honestly, in this text where Fichte's holding back and where he isn't holding back. Because at one point when he started originally talking about the concept of right, he says, that the object of the concept of right is free community of human beings. And it's also very voluntaristic. He says that people have to, the constitutional decision has to be unanimous, but when you're in it, you're in it. You can leave if you want. It feels very loose, the boundaries of this kind of state. And yet, nonetheless, he says, well, right can only permit us to pursue right. It cannot command it. It's not duty. And I wonder, just to leave off, do you think, is Fichte in some sense trying to hold back? Is there a kind of, I don't want to say meekness, because it's not a meek text. After this, he talks about the body. He deduces the concept of time in about 2 sentences. But what's the tension in this? But he feels like there's also tension here because, in a way, he can't escape being French. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, there's a Rousseauian social contract just bleeding into this,
No, this is so Rousseauian. And I mean, this, just to step back, like the thing that, I'm obsessed with Fichte. Like, I'm not obsessed with Fichte because I think he got everything right. But it's like, he's such a contradictory thinker, or if they're not contradictions, they're just all of these tensions all over the place that make studying him, at least for me, like a lot of fun and really interesting. And so this like Rousseauian element is certainly one of them. And even the very problem of the book is Rousseauian, which is like, how do you get freedom when you're around other people? Like, how is that possible? Like, they're going to influence you and you're going to be autonomous. Like, how do you reconcile autonomy within the context and influences of other people? And like Rousseau sets up the social contract essentially along those lines. And it's deep in the book, but about 70 pages in the book, Fichte says, this is the problem of political philosophy. And so even its framing of the problem is very Rousseauian.
No, absolutely. Craig, do you have any final thoughts when we come up to the hour?
Well, this is my first solid engagement with Fichte, and this comes after posting an episode on Hegel. And I just wanted to remind listeners, we are not turning into German idealists. We're going headlong into Anti-Oedipus next month, but it's always good to come back to this sort of thing. And especially as next year, I plan to do a little bit more with Kant. And this sort of had a flavor for that. And I mean, in some ways, I'm not so surprised, but it's always a delight to hear that as much as things change, things always stay the same. I'm just imagining Fichte, Kant, and everyone in that milieu on Twitter today, especially with respect to some of the opinions they had about the French and rationality and sensibility. And it's just interesting to see how those things are just recapitulated on, more or less the same coordinates, but with different terms in today's philosophical debates. So, thank you for bringing this to us, Gabe. It was awesome.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah.
Where can have you got any new publications coming? Any books to plug? Where can people find you if you want to be found, of course, if you want to be summoned?
You can find me on Twitter, Blue Sky. I'm more active on Gabe Gottlieb. I've edited some volumes in publishing. You can find me on academia.edu. But yeah, I'm out there.
Folks, you know where to go. You have been summoned to get your Fichte from Gabe. And Gabe wants to say thank you so much again for joining us on the show. Thank you for Merry Fichtmas, everyone. This will probably be the last episode before New Year. We summon you to have your vocation for this time is to have a fucking Merry Christmas. If you are so inclined to having a Merry Christmas, we are not going to imperiously posit that desire in you. But the summons is open. It's open. On that note, folks, I'll say thanks so much for listening. Merry Fichtmas, and we'll catch you later.